Well, Catherine, thank you, like I said, for joining us today. Now, let's get right into the interview. I mean, you are a very well respected and knowledgeable financial advisor. Please explain to our listeners how this idea that literally makes no sense, uh, unless you're a thieving crook, this idea called quantitative easing, this idea that's beyond an unconventional idea. I mean, printing money out of thin air, and then compounding interest on that money, which only serves the interests of the oligarchs in charge of that said money creation. Now, I heard you refer to, I mean, this as the deliberate looting of America. I mean, can you let our listening audience know about quantitative easing?
Well, it's much. I hate to make things complicated, but it's much more complicated than that.
Right.
Because if you look at how the system works, in fact, the average American has been for most of our history a beneficiary of that system, not a victim of that system. So there's a two-way street on that, and let's look at it.
Mm-hmm.
For the last 500 years, we've been on a system called the central banking warfare model, which is the central banks print money, and this is both Europe and the United States. The central banks print money, and then they trade that money for natural resources at low cost. And the reason the system goes is, for example, now the U.S. Navy controls the sea lanes and the satellite systems, and, basically people are told, you're all going to play because the liquidity of the reserve currency is backed up by force. So what we're literally watching is a global taxation system engineered through the currency. And think of it this way. So as we print more money, the value of the currency, and I'm grossly oversimplifying, falls steadily. And as a result, as it falls steadily, it falls on the balance sheet of the very people holding it. And think of that as literally a global taxation system that's happening through all the balance sheets. If you look, there's a wonderful institute of economic research in Massachusetts, the American Institute for Economic Research, and they estimate that as of several years ago, if you look at the cost of this kind of debasement, the drop in the purchasing power of the currency, it has cost American savers over the last, since the creation of the Federal Reserve, about, I think the number is 17, it could be $19 trillion.
Right.
So that's a fantastic tax that's happening on everybody's balance sheet. Now, if you look at the American saver, on one hand, they've been drained of this value in their savings. On the other hand, they've been the beneficiary of the wealth created by the global exercise of that same taxation system. And so, and those benefits come back in a variety of forms, including through the federal, state, and local government. And so, it's a double-edged sword as to how exactly it works. I think, what we're all realizing is that, let me step back. In the 90s, we went through a process where tremendous capital was drawn out of the U.S. and the North America system and Europe, out of the developed economies, and reinvested in the emerging markets and a variety of other places. And so we had literally what's called a rebalancing of the global economy. And so a lot of that was financed, Bruce, with debt.
Right.
So the developed economies tremendously increased their governmental and consumer and corporate debt, shifted that money into equity investments out into the emerging markets. If you look at the growth rate expected in those markets, in one sense it makes sense to do it. It was a very gut-wrenching process for the developed countries, particularly the middle class, because you're rebalancing the value of labor globally, and that can be very destructive. If I had to recommend to your listeners one video to help them understand what has happened over this process, there's a wonderful interview that Sir James Goldsmith did with Charlie Rose in 1994. If you go to my blog at Solari.com and do a search for Sir James Goldsmith, or just do a search on the web for Sir James Goldsmith and Charlie Rose. In 1994, Sir James Goldsmith came to the United States to warn and try and persuade Congress not to pass the Uruguay round of GATT, because it was that round of GATT and the creation of the World Trade Organization that really instigated this process of rebalancing the global economy and rebalancing the value of labor. And he described how destructive it would be for both, the broad class of people in the emerging markets as well as in the developed world. And it's very prescient. And, when people say to me, I want to understand what's going on, I say, you have to watch this video, because if you want to get it in one place in 1 hour, and what he's talking about is the centralization of political and economic power into a very centralized hands. And that's what we've been watching for the last 20 years. Now, what happened was, as I said, we moved all this money out, and a lot of that movement was predicated not just on shifting pension fund investment, for example, into the emerging markets, but the issuance of not only debt but fraudulent debt. And
Right.
so in 2006 to 2009, we saw the crashing of the credit markets, the so-called bailouts, as that fraudulent debt came to an end. And what we've been doing with quantitative easing is basically cleaning up the fraud. We went through the same process in 1989 when the credit markets crashed. We simply marked to market and auctioned off the paper. This time around, the fraud was so significant, and because of derivatives, they didn't use the same. They left the paper on the federal balance sheet or brought it into the Fed where it could be held quietly. And now my guess is what quantitative easing really is simply the Fed buying up and cleaning up all that paper. Wow. So we've been going up. We had the financial coup d'etat. If you want to learn more about it, there's one of my most popular blog posts is called Financial Coup d'etat, and just do a search for it on my blog or on the web and you'll pick it up. And it describes this process of sucking capital out of the developed world and shifting it abroad. And shifting it abroad in a way where when you take it into the other countries, you tank their value down so you can buy cheap. Naomi Klein had a great book called Disaster Capitalism or Shock Doctrine that sort of describes that process of, pulling capital out of the developed world's high and bringing it in and kicking them down so you can buy in cheap. And so we had the financial coup d'etat, then we had the cleanup of the financial coup d'etat, and literally what you're watching globally is a shift to the next step of consolidating power. And you're watching a little bit now of the deleveraging of the tax havens in the emerging markets as G7 sort of reminds everybody who's really boss.
Right.
To look at it, I like looking at things at a very high level. At the end of World War II, George Kennan said we have 5% of the people or 6% of the people and 50% of the resources, and this can't last unless you're tough and you drop a lot of bombs. And what we're talking about is a process of rebalancing to a world where the United States has 6% of the people and, much less of the 50%, but in a way where the financial interests in the United States and G7 have asserted their significant ownership and investment of the rest of the world, which is now sort of rising and rebalancing. Right. So, by 2050, we will be in a much more balanced world. And on one hand, I can say that process has been very gut-wrenching for many, many people in America, especially involved with so much, how much fraud was used and criminality was used to sort of engineer the transfer of the money. On the other hand, if you look at what had been going on in the discrepancy in sort of labor, education, and opportunity in healthcare in the emerging and the developing world, on one hand, that rebalancing is a good thing. Because it means, a lot more opportunity for people in those worlds. Why should we have all the fun here?
Right.
So that's what we're watching. The grand sweep is we're watching a rebalancing, and the thing that makes it very uncomfortable is it's being done with very tight central control and centralization of wealth in a system that creates, it creates a lot more friction. And so if you look at the system in terms of overall wealth, it's significantly less than could be. Anything this tightly controlled centrally and this invasive in terms of absence of privacy and surveillance and sort of, ability to trade on inside information centrally is a very uncomfortable, even Orwellian situation. So while they're centralizing wealth and lots of new technology is creating new wealth, we see the real destruction of wealth because of the absence of free markets.
Absolutely, and I've heard you state that, politicians just continue to kick the proverbial can down the road, right? They just keep
Well,
not.
but here's
Hmm.
here's my there's a wonderful quote from the Prime Minister in Luxembourg,
Hmm.
because once you've pulled all this money out and you've so take my generation, the baby boomers, whether in Europe or in North America. What you've done is you've kept them in the system with promises, 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 promises.
Hmm.
Now with this debasement of the currency, you've debased the value of those promises, and now that we've brought interest rates down tremendously, the pension funds and a lot of the retirement funds don't have the kick. So, a lot of those promises are beginning to look a lot more empty than people expected 10 years ago. And if you're a politician, how do you turn to people and say, oh, guess what? The rug's been pulled out from under you.
Right.
And so the Prime Minister of Luxembourg said, we know what we know what to do. We just don't know how to get elected, after we do it. And part of the challenge is not just because of the financial game that's gone on. Part of the challenge is the denial in the general population.
Right.
So, have you ever heard me tell my red button story?
I don't think so. No, you can go ahead and tell it if you want.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. Well, to me, the red button story is at the very heart of what we're grappling with.
Hmm.
I was giving a speech in the summer of 2000 in Philadelphia to a group of people called Spiritual Frontier Foundation, and they have a conference once a year to talk about how they can help evolve our society spiritually.
Right.
So this is a very intelligent, very well-educated, very spiritually committed group of people, very interested in the creation of a peaceful world. And so a friend of mine had asked me to give a speech called How the Money Works in Organized Crime, which became my article, Narco Dollars for Beginners.
Right.
And I'm in the middle of the speech, and I was talking about the congressional hearings related to the Dark Alliance allegations of drug dealing into South Central LA, where you are,
Hmm.
and the fact that at that time a spokesperson for the Department of Justice had told a reporter that I was helping with research that the U.S. economy launders $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of all non-transparent sort of illegal cash flows. So that's everything from drugs to illegal gambling to sex slave trafficking to financial fraud.
Right.
And given the explosion of financial fraud, my guess is that number is bigger today. Anyway, so we are the global leader in money laundering. A lot of the different squabbles you see around the money laundering or the clearance systems globally is sort of a competition for those market shares. So I said to this wonderful group of spiritually committed people, what would happen if we stopped being a global leader in money laundering? And so we had a little conversation. They said, well, that money would go to the other stock exchanges, so our 401ks and IRAs might go down, and that money, that money would not be available to finance the deficit because the people who control that money would be very irritated with us, and and our government checks might stop, but our taxes might go up. So I said, okay, let's pretend there's a big red button up here on the lectern, and if you push that button, you can stop all hard narcotics trafficking in your county, your community, your country tomorrow. Who here will push the button? And out of 100 people dedicated to evolving our society spiritually, guess how many would push the button?
How many?
One. So I said to the other 99, why would you not push the button? And they said, we don't want our taxes to go up. We don't want our government checks to stop. And we don't want our IRAs and 401ks to go down. And I said, so what you want is you want a variety of organizations and agencies to continue to market drugs to your neighbor's children.
Wow.
To keep your IRAs and 401ks up. And they said yes. And what I discovered that day was the problem was not that they wouldn't push the red button. The problem was that everybody was frozen in fear, afraid to talk about the fact that we were financially dependent on the profits of exploitation of a variety of different things.
Right.
And we couldn't talk about, okay, well, how could we turn the red button green? Because, in fact, there are ways of, changing this. Destroying our human capital and destroying our communities is not necessarily the best way to build wealth long term.
Not at all.
So there has to be a way you can turn the red button green. In other words, how can I make money pushing the red button? And what I discovered is the problem was not that we weren't pushing the red button. The problem was we had no way of getting into the invention room and talking with, look, where's all this money going, and how do we get the parties together to talk about how we re-engineer this, because with new technology and all sorts of other things going on, there is a way to create far more wealth. If you look at our existing wealth, in my estimation, is about 1% of what's possible if we were free to re-engineer. And part of the problem with being free to re-engineer is we have to be really honest about where all this money is going and what it's needed for. I used to have a pastor in Washington who used to say, if we can face it, God can fix it.
Of course.
And right now, to get back to my point here, we have an entire society in a state of complete denial. So let's just pretend for a second that 3 years from now we elect you president of the United States.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Catherine.
so you're President Bruce, and you walk into the Oval Office, and your James Carville your Karl Rove kind of person comes in and says, well, the American people just spent $1.5 billion overtly and covertly getting you reelected, and now they want payback. They want their check. They want their community block development grant. They want their defense contractor. They want they want money.
Uh-huh.
So you're going to turn to your Secretary of the Treasury and say, okay, Madam Secretary of the Treasury, go, keep financing the deficit. I want the Fed to buy their $85 billion of bonds.
Wow.
And your Secretary of the Treasury is going to say, look, you better be nice to the people who control $500 to $1 trillion a year of the dirty money and the accumulated capital thereon.
Right.
So what I'm trying to say is, if you look at what many people point to as the corruption is not them. Yes, it's going on in Wall Street and Washington, but it's going on in every neighborhood and every family in America, and we're all pretending it's not really happening. Yeah. Whether it's the drug dealing into our community, or it's the exploitation of natural resources for cheap, in communities all around the world, whether in North America. And we've all been the beneficiary. I've never heard one American say, something, my ancestors, to get this land, killed a whole bunch of innocent Indians and stole it, so I'm going to go find them and give them back a piece of my profits. I've never heard anybody say that.
That's the
but,
first time
maybe we should be asking that question.
Oh, you're absolutely right. That's an unbelievable story. Now, let's move forward here. Ben Bernanke. Now, he coined the phrase fiscal cliff, right, about a year ago. I think he must have been watching Thelma and Louise a little too much. But seriously, with the debt ceiling, with the debt to China, I believe now being, 1.3 trillion, and we owe them up to 7%. They bought up to 7% of the U.S. federal debt. I think it's safe to say we've long since gone over this proposed fiscal cliff they talk about. What changes have you seen, Catherine, since the extension of these Bush-era tax cuts, and what does it all boil down to for the American citizen?
Oh, Bruce, that's a big question. The central bank is in a frustrating position because you have two legs to this. You've got fiscal policy, which is the budgets decided on by Congress, and then you've got the central bank that can basically by buying up the mortgage securities can create the funding for the ongoing budget deficits. But neither one controls, it's like two hands clapping. And so Bernanke gets frustrating because he's asked to finance the deficits when the Congress can't re-engineer the deficits. I have an article up on my blog called Coming Clean Beyond the Fiscal Cliff, and I describe in detail what the problems are to re-engineering the federal budget, including the fact that so much money is going into the black budget, and because there's no transparency and the people controlling the black budget are so powerful, the politics of trying to re-engineer that is very tricky and very dangerous.
Right.
Okay? So you have a system which has been going on more or less for 70 years, and trying to find a process by which it can change and transform given the nature of we as a society, whether it's the different constituents interests that come into Congress or the Congress and the governmental apparatus, whether it's overt or covert itself, we don't have a common way to get into a room and evolve the model and change. And so you have things that are very stuck, and Bernanke's been called on to basically finance the stuckness, and off and on he gets frustrated, and you see these, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Now, what does it mean to you and me? What it means to you and me is we're living in a world where, who governs and why they behave the way they behave is behind a one-way mirror. They can see everything we do. They have deeply invasive technology to watch us all the time. It's a little bit like the Truman Show, and we can't see them and what they're doing. And as they centralize, the system becomes much more uncertain and volatile. And that means we have to adapt to living in a very, with tremendous, we've been in a bubble, the bubble's over, and now we have to manage uncertainty and volatility and organize our time and our money accordingly. And that's a very big change for most Americans. Now, it depends on which generation you're in.
Right.
If you're a millennial, and I think you're a millennial, aren't you?
I'm
what I'm
28 years old, so I'm an 80s child, that's for sure.
So you're what Neil Howe calls a millennial.
Okay.
So if you're a millennial, what you're doing is you have my generation, which are the boomers, and then between us is Generation X.
Mm-hmm.
And the boomers basically have one approach to the world. And if you look at their skills and their paradigm, it's inappropriate to the world we're going into. Now, what's interesting is the millennials are in a very good position to kind of make the shift. And so they're looking upstairs at the adults and saying, these guys have no idea how to proceed in this environment, but I'm going to proceed. And so the millennials are very solution oriented, and they're very let's get something done.
Right.
And so if you look at what they're doing, they're taking the new technology and they're proceeding with solutions, and you're seeing a tremendous shift between, the paradigm that the boomers are in and the paradigm that the millennials are in. And that's going to accelerate, particularly coming up this year with crowdfunding.
Right.
As crowdfunding becomes available. And we're going to start to see an explosion of changes in lifestyle and behavior given what's possible with adaptation of the new technology and the financing that crowdfunding, I think, provides to it.
Wow. Now, I think if anybody should be frustrated, it should be us and the American people. $9 trillion missing from the Federal Reserve, that's absolutely preposterous, right?
Well, we've seen, here's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back and you look at the history of the black budget, there's an official, our country and our world is a little bit like Disney World. There's an official reality, and then there's a reality, what I call the real deal. And, it's a little bit like Disney World. In Disney World, you have this wonderful world upstairs, and then downstairs you have another whole parallel universe that's rigging everything that's going on upstairs. And the cash flows and the money is an integration of the two worlds, okay? And, at Disney World, they've discovered that a lot of people would much prefer to just live upstairs and not know what's going on downstairs, okay? So that's the way our world works right now. And if you look at the cash flows in the federal government, what the official financial statements say and what they're supposed to say is completely and utterly different than what they're really doing. And one of the big differences is what I call the black budget. If you go back in 1947 and 1949, we passed the National Security Act and the CIA Act, and those two acts in combination meant that you could claw enormous amounts of money out of the official budget and send it into secret projects on a non-transparent basis. And then, Bruce, in 1980, we adopted an executive order that said, okay, that money can go to finance private corporations doing those secret projects. And you've had a number of other executive orders since saying that when they do that, they cannot report their SEC financial statements honestly and, all sorts of crazy business. And so what you've done is you've created an explosively large amount of money that is working, in entirely different ways than the official story. Now, one thing you can do as a citizen is is get cranky year after year about, if you look at, for example, between 1998 and 2003, we had over $4 trillion simply disappear from the federal government.
Right.
That's in violation of, I can't tell you how many laws and constitutional amendment or constitutional provisions that's in violation of. I mean, it's way beyond the law.
Outright
But,
theft.
Right, but I think it's critical to step back and look not at the I spent a lot of time documenting the $4 trillion missing, or the money, inexplicably said to be missing here and there. But here's the reality: it's not missing; it's financing a whole variety of systems, which are that parallel universe under the ground. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it's imperative, if we're going to find real solutions, to sit back and say, who's really running things and why are we behaving this way? Because at some point for real solutions, we need to deal with the truth. And I tell you, if you look at our current wealth, it's 1% of what it could be. We do not have an economic or political problem on this planet that I know of, unless there's something about space weather and the future of the planet that I just don't know, which is certainly possible.
Right.
But those kind of geophysical extreme stories aside, there is no financial or economic problem. We have a political problem. And you have a relatively small group of people whose control is, pretty complete and getting more so. And they are behaving in a variety of different ways, some of which are very destructive and or destructive, we think, to our interests. And the question is, who are they? Why are they behaving the way they're behaving? And what we can do about it. And I think if I could give one message, I've spent time at the White House. I've spent time in, working in a cabinet level kind of position, or assistant secretary position. I've managed hundreds of billions of dollars of government money. I've worked at Wall Street. I've been a member of a board of a number of different corporations. And what I can tell you is you cannot explain what's going on by, the people, in charge of these businesses or the people in charge of the government are evil. They're not evil. They're all prisoners within the system, and every one of them is afraid of, violence. Mm-hmm. The President of the United States knows that if he doesn't do what he's supposed to do, he will be killed.
Right.
So, the question is, who's got the power to kill with impunity, and who are they, and why are they behaving this way? Because we're living in a system that's run top down by force, and before we can change anything, we need to understand, okay, well, what's going on, and we need a solution other than saying our senators or governors, or congressmen are corrupt. I don't know that many Congress people, but the ones I know are extraordinary and exceptional and dedicated public servants, and I can't explain what's going on by saying that they're bad. That doesn't work.
Right.
So, right.
I mean, all these guys, all these criminals definitely have their hands in the American people's cookie jars, Catherine. But talking about the Federal Reserve banking system, I mean, it was created 100 years ago to date. It's the anniversary, actually, not too long ago. Well, pretty soon, right? This December, I believe.
Right.
Right. And, I mean, it's given the dire state of our economy, the fact that we have become the biggest borrower in the history of the world, what can we do besides abolishing the Federal Reserve? I mean, we'd have to outlaw all government borrowing, right?
Well, here's the thing. I don't think our economy is in dire state. Mm-hmm. As I said, I think we have a political problem, and we're going through a period of deflation, and the average household is experiencing their expenses rising and their income falling. And part of it is because if you look at what they needed to do in terms of behavior, habits, and skills, right, to be successful in this environment, they were encouraged to do the opposite. So, they're not eating fresh, healthy food. They're not getting the kind of education at low cost they need. They're not learning how to do more for themselves. If you look at all of the successful strategies of being successful in this environment,
Mm-hmm.
again, they're encouraged to do the opposite. So that's part of the problem. If you look at the American economy, I could argue that there's a lot going on here that's very, very positive in terms of long-term economics. So if you look at our domestic oil and gas production, it's increased dramatically, and so our oil and gas, we're remarkably self-sufficient. The price of energy and sort of if 40% of the cost of manufacturing is energy, it's greater than the cost of labor. And if you look at our competitive position in terms of energy, it's been improving dramatically since, for the last 10 years, and I think will continue. So that's a very positive part of the story. If you look at what we have in terms of agriculture, the most important asset globally increasingly is not going to be energy, it's going to be food. And we are an agricultural breadbasket. We have great water. If there's any danger facing the American economy, it's drought.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at what's been happening with droughts and the various things that have been happening that would interrupt the agricultural cycle, one of my big questions is where's that coming from? What's that about? How does it connect to chemtrails and other phenomena we're experiencing? And because to me that is the single biggest threat you're seeing. Add to that the Gulf oil spill, which had a devastating impact on the fishing and other sort of agricultural activities in the southeast states.
Right.
So I would say the biggest danger here, to me, is environmental changes and environmental pollution. But other than that, and the other thing is, if you look at the technology and innovation that's now happening and coming out of the labs, it's fantastic.
Definitely is.
Whether it's agriculture, technology, and innovation, or energy, to me, the American story relative to the global story is looking better and better and better.
Right. You know what? I tend to agree with you now that you said that. Catherine, let's talk about your upbringing, your education. I mean, I believe you're from Pennsylvania, right, where the real seat of power should be in the country, unlike right, unlike the corrupt Washington, D.C.
Alexander Hamilton made a deal to switch it out of Philadelphia into Washington.
Oh God.
I grew up. Now you're a youngster. Do you remember Chubby Checker?
Oh my God, I gotta Google him.
Remember the Twist? Did you ever hear the Twist?
Yeah, I've heard that.
I grew up at 48th and Larchwood in West Philadelphia. My father was a surgeon at the University Hospital and wanted to be near the hospital. He did a lot of trauma and emergency surgery. Anyway, so but I grew up at 48th and Larchwood, literally in a world that was, if you've ever listened to Bill Cosby's
right.
Early comedy, it was all about growing up on the streets of Philadelphia. So I grew up on the streets of Philadelphia, and it was the Motown years. So,
Right.
and Chubby Checker's mother lived nearby.
Oh, wow.
That was the big deal, Chubby Checker in his pink Cadillac. And anyway, so I grew up on the streets, and one of the most seminal experiences of my life was we had 4 boarded up, the drugs and the mortgage fraud came in, and catty corner, and it destroyed the equity value of all the homes, including my father's home, which at the time was his big asset, and or my parents' home. And catty corner to our, we had a little, VA financed row house. Catty corner to our home was 4 HUD sort of fraud deals that had been slab dab, rehab, fixed up, and then flipped, and then bankrupt. And it, if you look at the fraud pattern on it, it's very typical. And the Soprano TV show many years later had a whole series on how to do these kind of frauds. They're very, very common to the HUD inventory. Anyway, those were houses sat boarded up and empty for 4 years, while literally I had neighbors across the street, a family of 6 living in a 1-bedroom apartment. And I used to walk by that house and think, what, in my 10-year-old language, what sub-optimization that we should have a family that needs a home and this home sitting empty. And there was this big sign up in front of the home saying, by order of the Assistant Secretary of Housing / Federal Housing Commissioner. It's one of the longest titles in the federal government. And I used to think, who is this idiot that would let this happen? And when many years later I was sworn in as the Assistant Secretary of Housing, I had one hand on the Bible and one hand up, and the Secretary said, by order of the President, I now declare you the Assistant Secretary of Housing, Federal Housing Commissioner. I said, oh no, I'm the idiot. And I walked downstairs and I said to him, I called up my single family deputy and I said, how many boarded up homes do we have in America? He said 50,000. I said, okay, I want that down, by 25,000 immediately. Let's talk about how we do it. Because I realized, this is hundreds of thousands of children right. in America walking, among these boarded up housing thinking I'm an idiot. Can't have that. Anyway, so that was what got me very interested. Watching my neighborhood be destroyed sort of physically and economically got me very interested in, because when you would listen to people talk about why they had to do the drugs or why they had to do the housing fraud, it was always, this is what we need to do to make money. And if you look at the money that was being made, intuitively I understood it was a lot less than the equity valuations being destroyed. So it seemed to me intuitively that you could create a lot more equity value by reverse engineering this. And so I decided, look, it's very simple. I'm going to learn how all the money works and why these crazy adults think you have to destroy equity value to make money. Why they have this liquidation model, whether it's liquidating people or the value of homes. And what I didn't understand at the time, Bruce, was to literally understand how the money works in one community. Mm-hmm. You have to understand how all the money works on the entire planet, because if you look at how our governmental investment within neighborhoods are made, it's made by function. So it's organized by housing, transportation, blah, blah, blah. You have to master all the functional components before you can break it down and look at places. And then if you look, that's one side on the asset side of the balance sheet. If you look at the financial side of the balance sheet, you literally, the cost of capital is set by global trade and global flows, and we're literally competing globally for all the dollars. So your cost of capital is set globally. So whether it's the global financial markets or understanding government investment and private investment by sector, you have to kind of organize the whole thing. You have to understand the whole thing to understand, how you turn around West Philadelphia. And it was funny because when I left the administration, I discovered relational databases. And the power of that was you could take all the data, whether globally or functionally, dump it into a database and start to look at, okay, well, how does it work in Tulsa? And how does it work in Los Angeles? And how does it work in Hickory Valley, Tennessee? Right. You could start to manage the data in very dynamic ways and contemplate the idea of, okay, well, how do we finance places with equity? Because, in fact, with the new technology and this kind of transparency, you can start to think in terms of equity investment in places. And as I said, the current wealth is 1% of what it could be. Turning this around place by place, family by family, is how you get from 1%, to the kind of wealth that we could have.
Absolutely. Now, I believe you even you learned Chinese. You went to the Chinese University of Hong Kong, right?
Right. Well, it's
Tell
really
us about
funny.
That.
My father had served. They'd taken a University Hospital and moved it to Burma under Stilwell's command during World War II.
Right.
So I grew up hearing incredible stories about China and Shanghai Shek and Stilwell and Asia, and then I went to a junior college for my first 2 years, and what happened was I had a professor who had been the ambassador to Laos, and so he got me very interested in Asia, and it was interesting. All the classmates were going to Paris and Rome, and they were all going to Europe, and I thought, okay, well, I'll be different, and having been intrigued by Asia for many, essentially my entire life, I said, okay, I'll go the other way. And I had a theory, which is I didn't know where I wanted to live in this world. And I thought, if I just travel around the world and see all the different, countries and places, maybe I can find where it is I'm meant to be. It's all part, we all have to find our purpose in this world. Right. And part of that theory was I wanted to learn what it meant to be an American, and I think the best way I know to learn what it means to be an American is to go live in another culture that's completely different and speak their language, which is a whole different way of thinking. so it gives you a perspective on your world and your life, and you start to understand, oh, what I am is not the way the whole universe is. It's this part of me is uniquely American, and it gives you the ability to think, outside that box and look at things from a much more multicultural perspective. Anyway, and it worked. I have to tell you, when you think and live in Chinese, in Mandarin Chinese, you really think and look at the world very differently than when when you're an American and you speak our form of English. So I lived in Hong Kong for a year, and then I traveled back and came back and went to university in Pennsylvania and then business school and then up to Wall Street.
Wow.
So, yeah, it was, my road has been a very interesting one. And, I have to say I've had a lot of opportunity. No matter how bad things are in America, one of the things you see as you travel the world is our opportunities as Americans are incredible, even now, despite the friction in the system. And I think if, I'm very big on trying to practice an attitude of gratitude. And for this period of time, for my lifetime, having been an American was a huge blessing. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of Hong Kong, NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden was recently charged with stealing government property, whom it stole from the American citizenry. Now, it seems the government doesn't like it when we invade their privacy. Now, what do you make of this latest scandal, one of many that's been rocking this administration? And please tell our listening audience about your article that's up on Solari titled NSA Edward Snowden and What It Really Means. What are some of the things about this whistleblower and his past that raise some eyebrows?
Here's the thing. I when I left the Bush administration, I started a company called Hamilton Securities Group, which was very successful, and then became the target of a whistleblower. And I ended up, in fact, they used what's called QI-TAM legislation, which is whistleblower legislation. Mm-hmm. And I spent 11 years sort of litigating and dealing with this situation. And that's a perfect example of where a whistleblower is used to sort of force out the honest people in government and the and the people who work for them. So when somebody is a whistleblower, the politics of those situations can be quite complex. And, you're back in the puzzle palace where, things are not black and white, they're very gray. So, and I think there are a tremendous number of unanswered questions about Snowden and what's happened. But let me start with what I think the most important thing is. If you look at what the NSA and the American intelligence community has been doing in terms of listening and collecting information on all sorts of different digital communications, mm-hmm. That's been going on for a long time, and everybody knows it.
Right.
Now, not everybody, in the fact that many people are too busy to think about this stuff. Mm-hmm. But this is the first time you've seen a major push by the corporate media to make it clear to everybody that everything you say and do, on the phone and all sorts of other communications are collected and aggregated and looked at, whether by human or artificial intelligence. Right. And so there's been a real effort to kind of educate and desensitize global citizenry to what's really going on. And so the question is, why? What's that about? And I can come up with lots of theories. I don't think we know the answer. Right. But I'm not convinced that this is, I'm sure Snowden thinks he's, or probably thinks he's, he's doing what's in the best interest, but I think situations like these are used by a variety of parties for a variety of things. Now, what does it mean to us? What it means is, that we all have a much better understanding of what is in fact true, which is there is a one-way mirror. On one side, I have an article called The Data Beast, and I would recommend you all take a look at it. On one side, we have sort of a network of intelligence agencies and private contractors globally who have access in real time to every kind of imaginable data that you can imagine and the ability to aggregate it and use it for purposes of warfare and economic warfare and even trading the markets. And on the other side, we have us, and even though we are paying government fantastic amounts of money to collect data and make it accessible to us, we can't get access to it. And so if you've ever seen the movie The Truman Show,
Right.
I think what's dawning on all of us is we do indeed live in The Truman Show. And what that needs to, what we all need to do is to think about, okay, how do you want to behave in The Truman Show?
Right.
One of the things I'm always telling people is never, ever, 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 ever break the law. You break the law and they've got a control file on you.
Right.
And in fact, if you look at how the system is really run, it's run with a system of control files. It's funny, when I first went to work in the federal government, the cabinet secretary I worked for used to say to me, he said, look, I don't have the dirt on you, but I'm looking for it, and I will get it. And I say, Jack,
Oh, wow.
You're never going to find it because, I have spent my life living in such a way that I couldn't have a control file. And the problem with that is, if you've ever seen the movie Enemy of the State, what happens is if you don't have anything worthy of a control file, then they just make stuff up and make you spend 11 years and spend $6 million proving that it was all yaya.
Right, and you mentioned Enemy of the State. I mean, the technology they had in that movie to spy on
that's
Gene
what they had in
Hackman.
1998.
Yeah, 1999, 98. Imagine what they have now. Catherine, unfortunately, we're wrapping up here, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on a cartoon that I saw in an article that depicted a Chinese family sitting at the dinner table, and one of the parents tells their child not to waste any of the food because they're starving children in America. Now, I wanted to ask you, will China be superior to the U.S. economically by 2030?
I think China will be more in balance with the United States. China has some formidable challenges. They don't have the water and agricultural resources that we do. They have a real political challenge. How do they keep their population employed? And but at the same time, they have, in terms of a culture that can build wealth, they have one of the great wealth-building cultures, an enormous, fantastic human capital. Oh, another problem they have is environmental pollution. And I think what you're going to see is good, strong, long-term growth out of China. I think they're very good at thinking strategically, so they will face and address the problems, and you'll see a balancing. So I think their growth rate will continue to be much higher than the U.S., but I think in 2050 you'll see far more sort of balance of power between the two, but the U.S. still very powerful, still very much a leader on the world stage.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for being on our show. I look forward to having you on many more times. Thank you so much, and give your websites out to our listening audience so they can go and check out your articles and your work.
But you can find my website and all things about the Solari Report at solari.com, solari.com.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine, for being on.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you. Bye-bye.